We are so pleased to have with us General John Allen, Michelle Flournoy, and Ambassador Dan Shapiro, three dear friends of Israel Policy Forum, and I'm happy to say, all personal friends of mine. John was tasked by President Obama to develop a security plan for a sustainable two-state solution. Michelle was at the forefront of ensuring strong U.S.-Israel partnership on matters of national security and defense during her time as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And Dan is among the longest serving U.S. ambassadors to Israel and is intimately familiar with the strengths and challenges of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the pursuit of a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All three of you have been significantly involved in managing and strengthening the U.S. relationship on a variety of fronts, from security ties to diplomatic ties. So I'd like to start with how security ties could be impacted by the issue of annexation. First, why is the defense and intelligence relationship between the United States and Israel so important, and how would annexation impact this relationship? John, do you want to start?
Sure, Susie. First, it's great to see you. It's great to be back at the Israel Policy Forum. It's great to see Michelle and Dan. This is a really important moment, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to participate in this. I know our time is limited, so I'll try to be brief. First, and I won't speak for the other panelists, but my sense is they have a shared view. Israel's security is of extraordinary importance to me personally. It's been a deep commitment of mine my whole life. But there are larger issues involved here in the region, and the issues of annexation I worry a lot about. The relationship between the United States and Israel at a security level, at a military level, is very deep. In fact, in many respects, it's as deep as any relationship we have anywhere in the world with an ally. And that partnership has withstood long periods of time of stress. There have been occasions when we didn't agree on matters between our two countries, but nonetheless, the relationship between our militaries and our security services and our intelligence services have always been very, very deep. My concern about annexation is severalfold. One, the relationship that contributes to Israel's security is not just about the US and Israel. Much of Israel's security is a function of its relationship, for example, with the Palestinian Authority Security Forces, PASF. It's also a regional security matter. The nature of Israel's relationship with Jordan is very unique. It's been very cooperative. And while it doesn't necessarily find its way into the media on a regular basis, that security relationship, should annexation occur, I'm not sure where that will go. We may talk more broadly about diplomatic and nation-to-nation relations, but also in this period of time where there has been pretty substantial status quo with regard to Israel's security for a long period of time, we've seen the very quiet improvement of relations of Israel with many of its Arab partners. And that has had an important effect with respect to Israel's security, both its internal security, but also its security within the region. And much of the security between the United States and Israel and its partners in the region has been in many respects focused on Iran. And my fear is that annexation, which will almost certainly be, with the exception perhaps of the Trump administration, universally condemned. And we've seen a shot across the bow from the UAE ambassador, Youssef Otaiba. We've heard what King Abdullah, His Majesty King Abdullah has said about the potential problems associated with Jordan and Israel's relationship. And we've heard Mahmoud Abbas talk about the end of cooperation between the Palestinian Security Force and Israeli security forces. The annexation of some segment of the West Bank is a self-inflicted wound in many ways. And I really worry that not just on the ground immediately on the West Bank, but more broadly with its Arab partners, and in the end with America, we could see a challenge really to the security. And just very quickly, the face of American politics is changing. The youth of those who are being elected into our Congress, the rich diversity that it reflects, This may well see the change of American views on its commitment to Israel over time. And Israel needs to be thinking about this as it goes about the business of thinking about an annexation of the West Bank. So the close relationship with the United States and Israel will probably continue for some period of time, but it is not a certainty that that will not change over time. And I believe very certainly that there will be a change in attitudes about the Arab partners, and in particular with Jordan, should that annexation occur. And I'll stop there.
Michelle, Dan, do you have anything to add before I go to the next question?
Yeah, I would just say that I think any annexation or a unilateral Israeli move that really undermines the prospects of a two-state solution is going to have a number of effects, that all of which are negative for Israeli security. It's going to create greater Palestinian resistance and anger. It's going to further isolate Israel at a time when it had been starting to really build strategic relationships in the region. And it's going to undermine bipartisan support for Israel here in the United States and make it a much more partisan political issue, which is very much not in Israel's long-term interests, nor ours. So I think it has a lot of negative effects at the strategic level that Prime Minister Netanyahu just doesn't seem to be thinking through clearly.
Dan?
And I'll just briefly add that obviously associate myself with what both of my colleagues have said on the close and enduring and mutually beneficial partnership that we have with Israel, and why, therefore, Israel's security is an interest to us. One of the ways it will be injurious to Israel's security is that the map that would be required to fulfill the unilateral annexation plan that's envisioned by the Trump administration is kind of a bizarre serpentine set of new borders sticking into different parts of the West Bank and carving it up into a kind of Swiss cheese. And it would force a significant redeployment of Israeli security resources from the northern border and the southern border, where the major strategic threats it experiences lie, and where, of course, most U.S. assistance is then called on to help them defend themselves, and deploy it into this newly charged and potentially very volatile situation in the West Bank. So that's one concern. I'll just echo what was said about the blow that a unilateral annexation move could make to the bipartisan consensus around Israel, and that would be true at any time. But it's particularly true if this decision on unilateral annexation takes place right now, as the United States is heading into the final stages of a national election campaign, when it's very clear that while the current administration may support it, although its views may be evolving, that the opposition party does not, and that's across a very broad range, from the party nominee to the congressional leadership, who are all speaking about it this week, to people like Michelle Flournoy and John Allen and Dan Shapiro, close friends, long-time supporters of Israel, putting up a sign that says, you know, this is something that concerns us about our own interests, and we think this isn't the moment to take that step.
From a regional standpoint, and John referenced this, there have been strong warnings recently from King Abdullah of Jordan, from the UAE Ambassador Yusuf Al-Otaiba, and other Arab leaders about the negative impact that annexation will have on their own domestic situations and the ability of these states to maintain warmer ties with Israel. Michelle, how do you assess these warnings? And if there is a real downgrade in ties between Israel and other states in the region, what will the impact be on wider American interests in the Middle East?
Yeah. No, I think we need to take those warnings quite seriously. Over the last many years, quietly behind the scenes, Israel has been able to start building very strong military cooperation and ties with the security institutions in a number of Gulf states. And frankly, that has been a sort of quiet strategic warming based first and foremost on common concerns about Iran, its nuclear program, its support for terrorism and proxies, its nefarious activities throughout the region. But it's been I think Israel has hoped that over time, with progress, some of these relationships could come out into the open and be more fully developed. But I think what the Gulf states are saying is, look, if you insist on this unilateral move, without regard to the plight of the Palestinians, without regard to a peace process, we will not be able to continue down this road with you, because even, these countries may not be full-fledged democracies or democracies at all, but they do have to care about their street. And these leaders will not have the political maneuver room to continue investing in the relationship with Israel if Netanyahu and his government takes this kind of move. I think that will hurt all of our interests vis-a-vis developing a much more concerted coalition that can sort of push back against Iran, which is the primary threat in the region. And I think ultimately it will set back Israel's security and its prospects for kind of normalizing its relationships in the region.
John or Dan, anything further on that?
Sure. Michelle makes a great point, and that is, we have worked very hard in the last couple of years to turn the glare of all of our attention on Iran. Iran's regional terrorism, Iran's ambitions to be a regional destabilizing force, but very importantly on Iran's nuclear program. Now is not the time to break up that attention on Iran. And frankly, between Youssef Otaiba's op-ed and the reality that the normalization that has been promised in this long-standing thing called the Arab Peace Initiative, which says if the Israelis move forward and with Palestine the Palestinians come to an agreement, a two-state outcome, the normalization will move forward with all of the Arab states. That's dead. And what we will have done is, rather than to be focused on Iran and all of its problems, and I will tell you that in my experience with the Palestinians, they have no love for Iran. They have no desire to have a relationship with Iran. Now is not the time for that move, that unilateral annexation of however much of the Area C it might be, to deflect attention from Iran. And the attention, both in Europe and in other places, will be on Israel. They do not need that right now. We need to all be focused on Iran.
I put in the category of risk and opportunity costs, and I'm talking about for U.S. interests as well as for Israeli interests. There's real risk if anything would be done to undermine the stability of Jordan. Jordan is such a linchpin for regional security, dealing with problems from Iraq to Syria to ISIS, not only, of course, to its very effective security cooperation with Israel. And if the King of Jordan, who has been a reliable friend to the United States for many years, is telling us that there's real risk about how he would be able to manage the potential blowback in his country, we should take that seriously. Doesn't mean we have to accept it on face value, but we certainly shouldn't be cavalier about it. With the Gulf states, it's much more of an opportunity cost question. As both Michelle and John have said, we are building, can build, and can strengthen the opportunities for Israel and moderate Arab states to be a unified American, pro-American coalition dealing with Iran and the other common threats we face. And those Arab leaders are telling us, and are now telling Israelis directly in Hebrew in the Israeli media, this would make it much harder for them to proceed on that very welcome trend. I think we should take what they're telling us seriously, because that's opportunity cost that we don't want to have to deal with.
As you know, there are many different forms that annexation might take, from the 60% of the West Bank consisting of Area C to the 30% that's envisioned by the Trump plan, to smaller parts consisting of the Jordan Valley or the large blocks along the Green Line. Does it matter what form annexation takes? And would annexation of only the blocks that are in the Israeli consensus create problems for Israel on the world stage? Dan, I'm going to ask you to take this one on first, please.
Well, I'm here in Israel and I'm reading the Israeli press every day, and it's a wild read, because every day there are multiple contradictory stories about the form that the unilateral annexation plan is going to take. Some say it'll be the full 30% envisioned by the Trump plan. Some maybe even be augmented beyond that, because some settlers have complained that's insufficient. Some have said it would be just the Jordan Valley. Some say just the settlement blocks, some the outlying settlements. No one's seen a map, of course, and even the IDF, which would be called on to implement the annexation and defend the new borders, hasn't been seriously consulted. They don't know what scenario they're preparing for. So this is a very strange way to make a decision that has very significant strategic, societal, and national security consequences. But I think we shouldn't accept the notion that there's a better, quote unquote, better form of unilateral annexation. First, the United States has always opposed on principle unilateral steps by both sides and maintained that outcomes should only be achieved through direct negotiations. Unilateral annexation of any portion of the West Bank violates that principle, even if it involves areas that are expected and have been proposed in the past that Israel would keep in land swaps from earlier negotiations. Second, and IPF's Michael Koplow has written about this compellingly in recent days, once the lid is ripped off of that principle against unilateral measures, the Palestinians may have some unilateral steps of their own that they'll consider taking. And even if the United States opposes those, as I expect we would, many others in Europe, certainly the Arab world and elsewhere, may say, well, if Israel has taken unilateral measures, then the Palestinians can take their own, whether it's unilateral declaration of independence or measures in the international legal and diplomatic bodies. And third, every proposal for more limited annexation openly says this is just the first step, that it's just to lower the initial opposition, that Israel come back for more later. And there is a kind of inexorable quality to that advancement. There will be security arguments for why additional areas need to be annexed to protect those that were annexed in the first stage. There will be equity arguments about how Israeli settlers are treated in one group of settlements versus another. Once we get on that slippery slope, the precedent has been set. It's going to be very, very hard to reverse that. Last thing I'll just say is that, sometimes I think people ask if there's a difference because they understand that the tools one might use to respond to unilateral annexation might differ depending on whether it can in any way be accommodated with the longstanding vision of a viable two-state solution. The Trump plan clearly does not fit that category, but maybe a more limited annexation might be accommodated to that later. I don't want to speculate about what the tools would be because it's so hypothetical and so fact dependent, but it really shouldn't give anyone a reason to argue that there's something better about a quote unquote smaller unilateral annexation.
Yeah, Susie, if I could just add, I think one of the things that's been so striking to me reading some of the Israeli press and also just having private conversations is almost to a person, the Israeli security and intelligence professionals that I've asked about this have almost to a person said, this is going to be bad for Israel's security. Obviously the details matter, but they're very concerned about what this will provoke on the Palestinian side. The overextension of using the IDF to try to control vast amounts of territory with a hostile population. They are not excited about implementing this mission. And I think for the most, I don't want to speak for them, but I think many of them, particularly the recently retired senior folks, think this is just a bad move just from the perspective of Israel's long-term security.
And I'll come in behind Michelle. We have the very close relations with so many of the retired senior Israeli security leaders and IDF. And so many of them just say there is no security value to the annexation. Israel has full and complete security control of all the terrain that is necessary for Israel's security today without having to annex a single square inch of it. And the annexation itself will be declared illegal. Israel will be caught up in this long standing argument with the global community on this illegal act. And it will not have improved Israeli security by annexing Area C, which is already under full Israeli security. And here's an important point. Israeli security forces are in fact cooperating with other elements in the region for the security of Israel in the West Bank. But those entities, in particular Jordan, as Dan just said very well, Jordan has been a great security partner to the Israelis. I don't know what happens when they effect the unilateral annexation of Area C. Is that cooperation going to continue? And if it doesn't continue, that decreases Israel's security rather than increases Israel's security. And that's a very important point that has to be considered. Most of the security professionals are not convinced that Israel's security is enhanced by unilateral annexation, particularly in Area C, which is already under full control by the Israelis.
There's a general sense that for decades there was bipartisan consensus in the United States around support for Israel as a critical ally and support for a negotiated two-state solution. negotiate two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Over the past 3 years, both of these pillars of US policy have been called into question to varying degrees on different sides of the aisle. If there is a new administration come January, will that bipartisan consensus return? Or is American policy toward Israel destined to swing back and forth depending upon which party holds power? Dan, you want to try this one first?
Sure. Well, there's no question that President Trump has done much to turn the issue of Israel, which was, as you said, traditionally a point of bipartisan consensus, into a political football for partisan political advantage. He's called Democrats an anti-Israel and an anti-Semitic party, which is ridiculous. He's accused American Jews who vote for Democrats of disloyalty, not clear exactly to whom, which is offensive. And so there's going to be work to do to recover from this period. But I very much hope that an administration that is committed to the traditional pillars of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which are our commitment to Israel's security and its legitimacy and to helping defend them from any attack on either, our security partnership, our common values as two democracies, and our support for negotiated solutions to Israel's conflicts with its neighbors, including a two-state solution with the Palestinians, can help reestablish those principles as broad bipartisan consensus principles. And I'm hopeful that it's the case. Last July, the House of Representatives passed a resolution by a vote of 394 to 17, an overwhelming show of bipartisan support that embodied exactly those principles: opposition to BDS, support for the MOU, the $38 billion security package, identifying various threats that Israel faces both from Iran and from terrorist organizations, and a negotiated two-state solution, which of course is incompatible with unilateral steps by both sides. So while there are voices in both parties that are sounding different notes, I still think there's large numbers of Republicans as well as Democrats who adhere to those principles, which gives us a lot to work with if there is a new administration.
If I could, I would agree with that, but I do worry that if Israel pursues this unilateral course of annexation, you could actually see a fracturing, particularly on the Hill in Congress, a fracturing of bipartisan support for really critical pillars of our relationship, like the implementation of that defense MOU. I mean, I would hate to see, some in Congress decide they're going to hold hostage our security assistance to Israel as a way of protesting their policies in the West Bank. And that may not be the most likely outcome, but it's not unlikely either. And I think, I think that is what really worries me, is that it could really start to fray and tear at the really fundamental security relationship that has been in the interests of both sides since Israel's founding and across multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat. So that's what worries me. And I hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu and those around him appreciate the degree to which they are playing with fire, not only in terms of fracturing the region, but and their relationships with Israel, but also fracturing American political support, which would be terrible, absolutely disastrous, and an outcome nobody should want to see.
If I could come in as well, Michelle and Dan have really framed this well. But I think there's really an important point. Michelle used a term a few minutes ago, the street, in the context of how Arab leaders are going to have to listen to the people. It shouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the American street is aflame right now, as are the streets of many cities and countries around the world. And they're marching and they're angry about human rights issues and social justice and equality. These are all at the very heart of why the United States has championed for decades now a two-state outcome. It's all about the security of Israel, but it's all about a sovereign, independent state of Palestine, where the Palestinians will have a place for their self-determination, for equality, for a partnership with Israel that can do nothing but enhance the ultimate outcome of a young Arab state in that region.
but it's all about human rights. And that's the reason that we as a nation have championed this for so long. You have to be completely deaf and blind not to be paying attention to what's happening in the American streets and in the streets of capitals around the world on this issue. And to annex unilaterally a part of the West Bank right now, and is essentially condemning, through the maps that are coming out as well, condemning what might be a Palestinian state to some awful form on the ground, surrounded by annexed ground by the Israelis. That's going to resonate so poorly with the American street and the streets around the world that I think it's going to have a very negative effect on American politics over the long term. And assumptions about American support of Israel in Israel have got to be very carefully examined, because the diversity of American politics today that is beginning to appear in our Congress is a very different group of people than those of us who sat on the edges of our chair and watched Israel fight for its life in gallant struggles in 67 and 73. These are very young politicians who have a very different experience in America than we did. And assumptions that that kind of support for Israel will continue unabated or unchanged, I think need to be and look at the American streets right now, because the Americans are marching on these issues, and those are exactly the same issues that they will champion with respect to the Palestinians if we see a unilateral annexation of a large part of the West Bank.
That's a very sobering point, John, and it segues nicely into my next question, which is perhaps the largest departure from previous American policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict during the Trump administration has been our relationship with the Palestinians. I know you've touched on this, but I'm going to ask each of you to delve into this a little bit more. Is supporting the Palestinian Authority important? Why, how, and how does a functional relationship with the PA benefit American goals?
Well, I'll come in. Look, up to this point, up to this administration, we did have a very strong and constructive relationship with the Palestinians. And it was because we championed
a two-state outcome. We championed a peace that saw the separation of the West Bank and eventually in some form Gaza into a sovereign independent state, which would have a long-term, valuable, constructive political, economic, and security relationship with Israel. But you can't have that kind of a conversation as the United States. You can't have that conversation if we close the Palestinian office in Washington, if we stop our funding for UNRWA, if we in fact stack an entire process, the so-called deal of the century, and issue it without the Palestinian participation at all, you simply can't have a constructive movement forward. And one of the reasons that we have to have a relationship with the Palestinian is at its very heart, our American values of championing the rights, the human rights of these folks who have been occupied now since 1967, who have been at the table. And we've had lots of disagreements with the Palestinians, and some of them have been pretty substantial. But we can't go forward as a great nation championing the rights of the Palestinians and seeking ultimately a two-state outcome and a peaceful settlement of this crisis. We cannot go forward without a constructive relationship with the Palestinians. We must have that. We must have that for the benefit of Israel, not just the benefit of the Palestinians. And that's a very important point. And that's lost right now in the conversation. Somehow the Palestinians are being blamed for the deal of the century because they weren't at the table. Let's get realistic here. We should never give up our inherent American obligations to human rights and the rights of universal suffrage and to have an independent state. And the moment we do that, Israel is put at a disadvantage, not just the Palestinians.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think it's in everybody's interest to ensure that there is a viable political process through which the Palestinian people can pursue their aspirations and their freedoms and their rights and their future. Because if you really close that off and you really basically make people believe it's not possible, all kinds of negative things can happen, including a reversion to much greater levels of terrorism and attacks in Israel. But in addition, if we do want to get to a two-state solution, even if we had, you know, a miracle happen and there was a negotiated settlement, building the institutional capacity on the Palestinian side, so for self-government, for providing for their own security, for meeting the needs of their people, for effectively administering the state and the economy and so forth. That takes time, it takes investment. And we need to be chipping away at that now to enable the possibility in the future. And again, when this kind of unilateral action happens, all of that grounds to a halt. Again, as John has said, as Dana said, this is not in our interests, it's not in Israel's interests.
I'll just add that, you know, we can acknowledge that our relationship with the Palestinians is not likely to ever take on the broad strategic quality of our relationship with Israel. There are the very strong and moral humanitarian reasons that John and Michelle both mentioned to support Palestinian rights for self-determination in an independent state of their own that lives at peace and security with Israel. But it doesn't mean there's an equivalence of the kind of partnership we're going to have with the Palestinians to what we have with Israel, which has this broad regional strategic dimension. But to the extent that we have both the moral and humanitarian interests that we've all mentioned, and the strategic interest in ensuring the values-based partnership with Israel, which would, of course, be put at some risk if there isn't a two-state solution, and which we derive so much benefit from, it's manifestly in our interest to have a functional relationship with the Palestinians. And we can criticize them, we should, when they don't come to negotiations, when there's incitement, when they make payments to terrorists in Israeli prisons, that there should be a consequence for that, as there is with the Taylor Force Act. They've made their own unilateral acts that many of us have opposed. But we should also be committed to direct diplomacy with them. Right now, there are no channels of direct diplomacy. And while the Palestinians bear their share of responsibility for that, any administration that aspires to be a mediator needs to be able to talk to both sides. And it's been more than 2.5 years since there's been any U.S.-Palestinian direct diplomatic contact. The various assistance streams that John mentioned to support the Palestinian economy, hospitals, the security forces, who are critical partners, and any Israeli security official will tell you this, they depend very much on the cooperation that they have with the Palestinian security officials, which have been traditionally supported by the United States. The last thing they have wanted to see is that funding cut off. Nevertheless, the Trump administration has made a huge mistake by essentially cutting off all of those channels of communication and assistance for the needs of the Palestinian people and the institutions that Michelle referenced. So those are very damaging steps that are going to need to be reversed as quickly as possible. And obviously that may require a broader political change here in the US.
So as you all know, the theme of today's virtual event is responsible leadership. What does responsible American leadership look like on this issue? And how should the US go about reestablishing its credibility and its leadership role on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? This is for all three of you, but Michelle, do you want to start off? Wait, you're muted, okay.
Yeah. I think we have to go back to basics. Remind ourselves, what are our interests at stake here? Our interests. What kind of relationship do we want with Israel, the sole democracy in the region and an historical ally that with very close ties on a societal basis? How should our values influence our policies? And how do we get back on track to shoring up support for Israel's security and our relationship with them, both domestically, but also regionally. And that may take some very candid conversations. I mean, one of the things you want from close allies is candor. And we need to have some candid conversations with the Israeli leadership about, again, this idea of playing with fire and what they're putting at risk in pursuing this agenda without thinking through the strategic consequences. So I think there's no country that will at least be listened to. Maybe they won't like everything we have to say, but you know, I think it has to come from a place of we care about the security of Israel. We care about its future as a democracy. and as an ally, and any pushback that we provide on some of the particular policies like unilateral annexation is coming from that place. But I think a new administration has to go back to basics, take a much more strategic perspective, and engage with both the Israelis and the Palestinians and the region with a much more candid conversation about what's possible and what we should be pursuing together.
John, Dan?
Well, I'll come in. Michelle framed it absolutely perfectly. And in the end, I'll sort of end here where I started, which is an unambiguous lifelong commitment to Israel's security. It's very important to me. But we can have security and we can have peace, and the Palestinians can have a future. And finding our way politically and diplomatically to have that kind of conversation is really what's important in the future. Vast majority of Americans really do want to see Israel be a strategically viable democracy and a long-term strategic partner of the United States, but they also want to see that the Palestinians will ultimately achieve a level of peace, an independent state, and a degree of sovereignty that is consistent with American values, as well as, frankly, Israeli values. So this is not a two-party conversation. This is a three-party conversation. And as Michelle said, the long-term interests here are for Israel's strategic security and relationship with the United States. And in doing that, we have the space within that conversation to achieve the kind of long-term two-state outcome that we have been trying to achieve, because it's consistent with our values and it is consistent with Israel's values.
Dan?
I can hardly improve on the descriptions that both Michelle and John have given here. I'll just add a couple of points. I fully endorse Michelle's framing of going back to first principles, which of course for the United States and for former U.S. officials like us has to be on U.S. interests. Of course, we all define U.S. interests very much as including Israel's security, Israel's survival, Israel's recognized legitimacy, Israel's ability to achieve peace with its neighbors. All of that's the case. Obviously, Israelis, from times when different governments are in power, may make different judgments. And of course, they are able to make their own judgments. But we have to have the kind of candor in our conversation that Michelle referenced to say to them, this particular step you're considering is one that affects our interests. John and I wrote about this recently in an article in The Hill, that we define the danger here not only to Israeli security, again, an Israeli decision to make in a way, but one that affects us and affects our ability to protect our own interests in Israel's security, but also more broadly in the region. And when some of Israel's very best friends in the United States, including people like Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Ted Deutsch and the three of us and many others, including many people involved with Israel Policy Forum, are telling them as friends, this is something that we believe that could be damaging to our interests. I very much hope that will be taken seriously. I think it should, and I think it should certainly be at this time of a political season. The last thing I would just mention is that we also have to be realistic. I don't believe there is an immediate opportunity to re-engage Israelis and Palestinians under their current leaders, who have had so many failed negotiations and have built up so much mistrust with one another. To bring them back to the table and immediately try to negotiate a two-state solution, I wouldn't counsel anybody to try that right away. But there are many things that can be done. We've talked about a lot of them that can keep a two-state solution alive and viable through a period when it's obviously difficult to make progress, but to keep it possible so that when different leaders emerge and the regional dynamic is improved, that it's still an achievable objective. And that, I think, needs to be a very high priority for responsible leadership in the next administration.
So we are at the end of our time together. I want to thank each of you, John, Michelle, Dan, for a very instructive, I will say sobering conversation. Each of you has devoted many, many years professionally to working towards peace, not only in Israel and Palestine, but in the broader region. And I hope that everyone who is listening to this takes to heart everything you've said, because You speak not only from a position of experience, you also speak from, I think, a position of love for Israel, for its people, for its future. I think we all share that. Certainly I do. And so this is hopefully a wake-up call before it's too late. This is 8 days before the Knesset can proceed with annexation on July 1st. And I hope that responsible leaders are listening and will take into account everything that you have shared with us. So thank you, the three of you, so much for doing this, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Easy.
Thank you. Good day.
Be safe.